Hi, everybody. How are ya? Can we give it one more minute, maybe? Although everybody's very punctual. Except for me, that is.
I simply said that nobody can claim that it got stuck in a traffic jam getting here.
Exactly. My system went down. Okay.
I am finishing breakfast.
Oh, well, you are entitled. Sounds good. I'm still having my coffee, so it's okay. So maybe we'll get started now. We've been discussing the basic structure of an economy, the basic choices that are made in an economy by individuals, by citizens, by businesses. We've discussed some of the theories of social justice in an economy and distributive justice in particular, theories that range from very strong individualism to the so-called universal destination of goods, that property is to be privately owned and that's all there is to it, to the idea that there is a common social moral framework for property within which private property plays some role. And today I want to talk about another important dimension and challenge of economic life, and that is cooperation. Generally in economics, we talk about competition in the marketplace, about perfect competition or imperfect competition. But cooperation plays an enormous role in our lives in every day, caring for each other, supporting each other. And cooperation plays a fundamental role in achieving desired economic outcomes. Cooperation for a common purpose, cooperation within a team, cooperation within a company, cooperation within a society. The question of competition versus cooperation is therefore a very central question and a kind of puzzle also. Do human beings cooperate? Do they cooperate enough? What leads to cooperation versus conflict or a breakdown of cooperation? Does it matter? So these are core questions of economics, though they're not really discussed enough in mainstream economics. And the concept that I want to talk about today is a particular vision of this issue of cooperation. It is the question of what is called pro-sociality. That is, taking actions for the benefit of others. Do people do it? When do they do it? How much do they do it? Is it a good thing to do? Should we care about pro-sociality or its opposite, anti-sociality? And if pro-sociality is a good thing, what promotes it? Where does it come from? And if it's really a good thing, why is it even an issue? Why would people not be pro-social if it's desirable to be pro-social? So those are the themes that I want to discuss today. And it's a very rich discussion and a very burgeoning field of inquiry, because the question of whether and how and why people cooperate is a central issue not only for economics, but also for politics, for sociology and anthropology, and for psychology and neuroscience. Psychology to understand what is it that leads us to cooperate in terms of our psychological makeup, and neuroscientifically, what is it that makes our brains make choices that are pro-social or anti-social. So all of this has led to an enormous burgeoning of research of many, many kinds in recent decades, and I'll try to describe some of that today. So I'm going to share my screen and start the PowerPoint. So let me go here. So our theme is pro-sociality, trust, because trust among individuals is an important part of sociality. Sociality says, we'll cooperate, but we'll cooperate if I trust you to cooperate. And fairness is an important part of pro-sociality, or certain aspects of pro-sociality. So pro-sociality broadly is defined as behavior that benefits others or that benefits society as a whole. And part of the challenge and complication of analyzing pro-sociality is that it comes in many forms and has many distinct features and distinct motivations. So pro-social behaviors include helping others, giving, charity or philanthropy, or volunteering work, cooperating with others, agreeing to do something and then following through, sharing a common resource with others, and trusting others, putting your fate in the hands of others can be an important component of pro-sociality. And pro-sociality, that is, behavior that benefits others, can have many motivations. And of course, different kinds of pro-sociality will be based on varying motives. So one motivation of pro-sociality can be altruism, that you care, or that somebody, an individual, cares about the well-being of other people. This is obviously a deep human motive in many contexts. Another reason for pro-sociality can be reciprocity. I'll help you, but I expect you to help me. Maybe simultaneously, maybe sequentially, maybe sometime in the future, maybe just in general terms, if I'm helpful to others, probably others will be helpful to me, even if it's not direct reciprocity with a particular individual. Pro-sociality can be motivated by fairness, by norms of fairness. This is the right thing to do. I should share rather than take everything. And that idea of fairness begs a question, where would that come from, that idea? But pro-sociality can be motivated not because of reciprocity or even wanting to help the other, but just because it's the fair thing to do. Pro-sociality, behavior that helps others, can be motivated by social conformity. Others are doing it, I better do it. I don't know why, it doesn't feel so good to me, but this is what everybody does. Pro-sociality can be motivated by social esteem. If I don't cooperate, if I don't help others, I'm going to be held in low esteem, and that's going to hurt. And pro-sociality can be motivated by duty, a religious command, or a Kantian categorical imperative. It is my responsibility to be pro-social. I just feel it. Of course, where that feeling comes from is one of the puzzles of psychology, neuroscience, and theology, let us say, and philosophy, because theologians, philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscience scientists have all had their hand in trying to understand the sense of duty. So pro-sociality is in many forms, and it can have many motivations. And there is anti-social behavior as well. And this we all know, and it comes in many, many forms as well. People can hoard avariciously. They can be greedy. They can be misers. They can steal what belongs to others. People can cheat on commitments that have made or lie to others. People can free ride saying, yeah, of course it's good to do the following, but I'll let the others do it. I don't want to do it. People can defect from promises made, but then not deliver them because delivering them costs resources. People can be disloyal or traitorous. So there are many kinds of antisocial behaviors. Individuals that repeatedly engage in antisocial behaviors to an extreme degree are often categorized as having antisocial personality disorders. And indeed, for some people, it seems behaviorally, maybe genetically, maybe in personality terms, pro-social behavior is simply not part of their behavioral repertoire. A lot of pro-social behavior in the last 30 years has been studied in formal games. Games are not necessarily board games like chess or Go, but are strategic situations that can be where the behavior in those strategic situations can be examined systematically. There are many kinds of games that are examined in trying to understand the nature and limits of pro-sociality. Perhaps the simplest game of all is what's called the Dictator Game. It's a game of just one person where another is present but takes no action. So in the Dictator Game, player one in the game has an endowment of goods or money. And player one can choose to give some of that endowment to another person. As simple as that. That's the game. I have something, I can give it to you, the counterpart. And this game can be examined in a lot of ways, that I am looking face to face at the counterpart, or that it's an anonymous gift, and so forth. And the question is, in this Dictator Game, what does player one do? So in a standard setup of the game, player one is given points or money, perhaps $10 or $100, and told, you can share it with player two. You could divide it 50-50. You could keep 90 and give 10. So that's what's shown in the second parentheses. In each of these parentheses, the first item is what goes to player one. The second item is what goes to player two. Or you could keep everything. So you could give 0 to player two and keep 100 for yourself. When this game is actually played, you get varying outcomes. In a standard economics assumption, the equilibrium of the Dictator Game is the keep everything. Why give something to the other person, especially if the other person's a stranger or if the other person is anonymous? And so the prediction of standard game theory, which assumes that each individual cares only about their own outcome is that the equilibrium of the dictator game is the third parenthesis. Keep 100, give 0. In fact, in this very simple game, when it's played in classrooms or online or in other venues, the dictator, that is player 1, usually gives something to player 2, and sometimes as much as 50-50. And this is a kind of pro-social behavior. The player is giving something for the benefit of the other person, who might be a complete stranger, who might be a counterpart that the first player is never going to see again. But something leads player 1 to share the endowment. What exactly that is, that's for us to discuss. The point here is this is an extremely simple, the simplest strategic setup. The experimental result is that the first player usually gives something, and often half of what they have, to the second player. Another variant of this game is called the Ultimatum Game. So follow the arrows. The player 1 starts with an endowment of $100 and then makes a choice to divide the endowment. For example, in the illustration here, $90 kept by player 1, $10 given to player 2. Then in this ultimatum game, unlike the dictator game, player 2 has a choice. Player 2 can accept the offer, and in that case, the $90 goes to the first player and $10 goes to the second player. Or player 2 can reject the offer, in which case nobody gets anything. So if an offer is made by the first player, $10 to the second player, and the second player says, no, I don't accept, then both players end up with 0. So this is a game that unfolds in a sequence of actions, sometimes called an extensive game. And when economists that take the assumption of totally individualistic motives analyze this game, they work backwards and they ask the question, what will player 2 do? So consider player 2, who has a choice of accepting $10, and in which case player 1 ends up with 90, or rejecting the $10 offer from player 1, in which case player 2 ends up with 0, and player 1 also ends up with 0. Well, an economist would say $10 is better than 0. So clearly player 2 receiving this offer will accept, and the equilibrium, the outcome of this game, would be $90 by player 1 and $10 of player 2. Now, knowing this, player 1 could reason the following. If I give any amount, $1 to player 2, player 2 is going to think that that $1 is better than nothing. So player 2 is going to accept my offer. So I, player 1, caring about myself, but knowing that player 2 is rational, will accept an offer, even a very low offer. So I'm going to propose $99 for myself, $1 for player 2. Player 2 is going to be a bit disappointed, perhaps, but say, $1 is better than nothing. I'll accept the $1. And I, player 1, will therefore end up with $99, and player 2 will end up with $1. That is the prediction of the ultimatum game by economic reasoning that assumes that individuals maximize their personal outcome. It's not at all what we observe, however. In the ultimatum game, when it's actually played in a classroom or some other setting, if player one dares to give $99 to himself and only $1 to player two does not say $1 is better than nothing. Player two says, to heck with that. We're both going to end up with zero, because that's an outrageous offer. And so in righteous indignation, player two will reject such a meager offer by player one, and both would end up with zero. That is one of the outcomes when this game is actually played. But a more typical outcome is that player one either reasons that it's risky to just give $1 to player two who might be indignant, or even $10. Player one might reason, I better give something that is viewed as pretty fair, actually. So when this game is played, player one often gives $25, $30, $40 to player two. And if player two then says, not bad, not equality, but not bad, I'll accept it, then both sides end up with their outcome. And it is not unusual in the ultimatum game for player one to divide the endowment 50-50. We saw that even in the Dictator game, when there can be no rejection of the offer, the endowment is sometimes equally divided, just because that is perhaps the sense of fairness, norm, duty, whatever the motivation. But in the ultimatum game, there's an added element, which is that the offer needs to be seen to be fair enough that player two does not indignantly reject it. So in the ultimatum game, it's not unusual for player one to offer a 50-50 division of the endowment, even though the theory suggests that a 99-1 division should be sufficient, and after all, much better for player one. In other words, there's more pro-sociality than would be predicted by the extreme individualist assumption. That's true in the Dictator game, and it's true in the ultimatum game as well. There's another game called the trust game. This is an interesting game, and I illustrate it this way. Player one starts out with an endowment again, say $100. But player one, in transferring the endowment to player two, gives not only the $100, but some multiple of the transfer, because perhaps player two has an investment opportunity that can be made to multiply the value of the money. So in the example here, what player one gives is tripled when it arrives to player two. So player one could keep the whole endowment and player two would get zero. Or if player one transfers the whole endowment to player two gets $300. But then player two has a second move to give back or not some of what player two now has. And player two could choose, for example, to give back nothing to player one and say, yeah, I now have $300. Or player two could say, player one entrusted me with his endowment or her endowment. I tripled it. Now I'm going to return half of it to player one so that we each end up with $150. Well, that's the best outcome. Player one giving to player two everything, and then player two dividing the bigger pie 50-50. and player one ends up with $150 and player two ends up with $150. But the economist reasons as follows. Player one says to herself, if I give away $100 to player two and player two triples that, what's going to lead player two to give me any of that share? Wouldn't it be reasonable for a selfish, individualistic player two just to keep the $300? That would be the equilibrium, says player one, especially after having a semester of economics. So player one would say, if I give money to player two, the money will be tripled, but I won't get any of it back. Given that, instead of ending up with $150, I'll end up with $0. Given that, I'm not going to give anything to player two. I'm going to keep my $100. It's not as good as $150, but it's better than $0. So in the trust game, the economist's equilibrium, based on this kind of reasoning of self-interest, is that the outcome is that player one transfers nothing, ends up with $100, forgoes the chance to have $150, and player two ends up with nothing. How sad. Instead of having a pie of $300 to share, the pie stays at $100 and is grossly unevenly divided. Moral of the story of the trust game: trust could be a win-win proposition. But if there's lack of trust, the opportunity for distrust won't even be tempted. Rather, the chance to expand the size of the endowment will be foregone. And player one will keep the endowment, and player two won't have anything to triple in the end. That would be the economist's presumed equilibrium. What do we actually observe in the trust game being played? We observe much more the outcome 150-150 than we observe the outcome 100-0. In other words, there's trust. There's no obvious reason for that trust, but the trust is enough to instill a transfer, or to spur a transfer from player one to player two, which is then tripled and then subsequently shared. Two steps of pro-social behavior that ends up beneficial for both parties. Again, the conclusion is that the economist's worry or vision of completely self-motivated behavior is not an accurate description of actual behavior. There's more trust and pro-sociality than would be expected on the view that individuals only base their actions on maximizing their individual outcome given the strategic stage of the game. There's another category of outcomes related clearly to all of the games that I've mentioned: altruism. One way of describing altruistic behavior is that player one incurs a small cost to give a big benefit to somebody else. So in the example that I'm showing here, player one incurs a cost of $10 to give a benefit of $20 to the other person. Altruistic behavior might mean pushing someone out of the way of an incoming car at a small risk of being hit, but not a very big one, but sure damage if you don't take such action. Holding the door open for an infirm person, it's a tiny cost, but it has a very, very big benefit. So altruism in this formulation is simply a transfer that helps someone else, but it's not a one-for-one transfer. It's a one for more than one transfer in this example. Such altruistic behavior is, of course, widely observed. People help other people all the time. Any day out on the street, you can see people bending over to pick something up or run to give back to somebody something that they have dropped, or helping people to avoid a danger that they might not have seen, or giving a tip to somebody that you'll never see again. All of these acts of altruism occur regularly, and this is maybe one interpretation also of that first outcome of the Dictator Game. Of course, there's another kind of outcome, which is the antisocial flip side of altruism, the cheating outcome. In this case, the first player can impose a cost on the second player to gain something which is less than the heavy cost that is imposed. So in the example here, the first player steals from the second player, for example, or embezzles or cheats or defrauds the second person. The second person ends up losing a lot. The first person gains a little. And this, too, in some cases, can be the antisocial equilibrium. Now, there's another category of outcomes somewhat different from this first category, where individuals make decisions to help or hinder a counterpart. And that is where a strong degree of mutual gain is present. The trust game is an example of this, but I will show you the even more famous example of such a reciprocity game. So reciprocity means games in which it's possible to have a mutual gain through joint pro-social behavior, and where the motivation for pro-sociality is that I'll do it if you'll do it, because then we'll both be better off. So this is a familiar strategic setting. And in this particular case, let's suppose that each player can do something at a cost of 10 to themselves that gives a benefit of 20 to the other. So each one can take a small cost for a big gain for the other person. If both do this, if both give $10 to the other, they each end up with a net gain of $10. If both do not give, they end up with zero. Nothing happens. What happens if one player gives to the other and the other doesn't reciprocate? So in this form of the game, player one is represented by actions in the rows, and player two is represented by actions in the columns. And the first item in each box is the payoff, for example, the monetary payoff to player one, and the second number is the monetary payoff to player two. So suppose that player one doesn't give to the other person and player two does give to the other person. Player two is pro-social, player one is not pro-social. In that case, player one ends up with $20 because of player two's generosity. Player two ends up out $10 because they've been generous, but the first player hasn't reciprocated. So if one gives and the other doesn't give, the non-giver benefits a lot, and the giver loses. This is a standard strategic setting where there are gains from reciprocal behavior. In other words, both parties choosing to give benefits both of them by a net $10, but where there's also a social dilemma, so-called, where one player says, I'm happy to receive, but it's costly to give. So maybe I won't give, but I will encourage my counterpart to give, in which case I'll end up with 20 and my counterpart will end losing 10. Let's analyze this situation just for a moment. Let's think about the perspective from player one. Player one's asking, should I give my $10 for the benefit of the other party or not? And player one could reason as follows. If player two gives, I end up with $20. If player two gives, and I conversely also give $10, I end up with $10. If player two gives and I don't give, I end up with $20. Better. So if player two is going to actually make the contribution, the pro-social contribution, it's better for me not to do so. How about if player two doesn't make the pro-social contribution? Well, if I do, I end up out $10. But if player two doesn't make that contribution and I also don't, I end up at zero. Again, if player two isn't going to be pro-social, better for me also not to be pro-social. Conclusion, if my counterpart is pro-social, better for me to be anti-social. If my counterpart is anti-social, better for me to be anti-social. No matter what the other player does, better for me not to be pro-social. So player one says, obviously, I shouldn't give. No matter what my counterpart does, I'm going to end up worse off. Player two reasons exactly the same thing. The equilibrium in this case then is the lower right-hand quadrant. Nobody gets anything. Both players end up with zero. But they could have had $10 each, but instead they end up with zero. This is a failure to cooperate. It's a failure of reciprocal cooperation. It's also striking that 0 and 0 is the equilibrium outcome under the economist's assumption of self-regarding individualistic behavior, because it's the right strategy to take no matter what the counterpart does. Sometimes it's called the Nash Equilibrium for John Nash, the famous Nobel laureate who devised this concept of equilibrium. So the Nash Equilibrium, or the dominant strategy of this game of reciprocity, is that neither side is pro-social and both sides squander the chance for cooperation. So I'm sure that you recognize this setup as the prisoner's dilemma. This is the famous game in which there is a benefit for cooperation, but there is a temptation to cheat or to defect or to not give, whichever term one uses. In the original prisoner's dilemma, the non-cooperation was to confess, because the game was whether the two prisoners in separate rooms being interrogated, which would confess, or whether they would stay silent. If they both stay silent, they both gain. If they both confess, they lose. But the temptation is for each one to confess, hoping that the other won't confess. And that the equilibrium in the prisoner's dilemma is that they both end up confessing. So whichever term we use, defecting, cheating, non-cooperating, antisocial behavior, confessing, the idea of the prisoner's dilemma is that it's better to cooperate, but the outcome is non-cooperation because that's the best strategy for each player given what the other is doing. But when the prisoner's dilemma is actually played, the outcome is usually not 0-0. The outcome more typically is $10, $10. In other words, people find a way to cooperate even though there is the temptation to cheat or to defect. And put it another way, there is more pro-social behavior than would be expected on the hypothesis of simply individualistic, self-regarding behavior. This prisoner's dilemma issue is pervasive in our lives because it is pervasively true that we have counterparts that if we can agree and follow through on doing something mutually beneficial, we both gain. But where there's the temptation to let the other do it, but for us not to go through with our side of the deal. And so this prisoner's dilemma can be applied in many contexts. Another context would be, for example, an arms race or arms control. You could imagine the US and China right now saying it would be better if both of us abstain from cyber warfare or from creating a new generation of super smart, quote unquote, nuclear weapons. That's costly, terribly destructive of the other side. And if we both do it, potentially disaster for both of us. On the other hand, if we both abstain, we get the benefits of peace, cooperation, and avoiding the high costs of an arms race. So the prisoner's dilemma environment for geopolitics would say there are gains from the US and China cooperating. But each side might say, yes, if the other side will unilaterally disarm or not modernize its weapons, and we cheat by continuing our cyber research or preparing better cyber tools, we can spring it on the other side, gain a big advantage, and not fear the retaliation. Of course, then each side says, the other side is going to do that also, so we can't even trust the other side to do that. And the outcome is that despite the potential large gains from cooperation, we could be led into an arms race or cyber insecurity and so forth because of the inability to achieve the reciprocal outcome. As the experiments demonstrate, however, prisoners' dilemmas are not hopeless. In fact, there's a lot more cooperation actually achieved in practice in these strategic situations than one would expect, because in some way, human beings are more disposed towards pro-sociality than is assumed in the standard economic game theory framework. So how can the prisoner's dilemma be overcome? Well, one simple way is to not just trust the other side or not just imagine what the other side might do, but actually to make a contract. So the two parties could sign a legally binding contract that they're each going to give $10 for the benefit of the other. And that contract would be enforceable in a court. And then there would be no question but ending up in the top left-hand corner. So a binding legal contract is, of course, one way to overcome the prisoner's dilemma. Another way to overcome the prisoner's dilemma is to realize that with many of our counterparties, we're going to be playing such games for a long time to come. And if we cheat now, well, it's going to be much harder to cooperate in the future. So in iterated prisoner's dilemmas, where the game is played every year, every month, there are benefits to not cheating, because cheating could instigate retaliation from the other side, and then all of the potential benefits of cooperation could be dissipated or lost. A third common way to overcome the prisoner's dilemma is third-party punishment for the defector. So if two people agree on doing something and one cheats, even if there isn't a legal contract, the cheater could face punishment by outsiders who find that behavior outrageous. And that kind of third-party punishment is a typical mechanism for enforcing pro-social behavior, even when there's not a legally binding agreement. A common approach to prisoner's dilemma, reciprocal benefit type strategies, type games, is what's called the tit-for-tat strategy. The tit-for-tat strategy is a way to play a repeated prisoner's dilemma. It's a simple rule. It says, I'm going to face a counterpart. I'm going to start with cooperation or with giving or with the pro-social act. If my counterparty also cooperates, then in the second round of this game, I'm just going to continue cooperating. If my counterparty cheats in the first round, then I'm going to not cooperate in the next round. And for each round, I'm going to follow a simple rule. If my counterparty has cooperated, I will choose cooperation the next round. If my counterparty has defected or cheated, I will defect or cheat on the next round as well. So suppose that player 2 is playing tit-for-tat strategy against a player 1. And suppose there are 7 rounds shown at the bottom. And in round 1, both cooperate. In round 2, both cooperate. In round 3, player 1 cheats, defects, whereas player 2 cooperates. Oops, player 2 has just been had by player 1 who cheated. Well, then player 2 playing tit-for-tat strategy says, because my counterparty defected, I'm going to defect now in round 4. And then the outcome would be defect, and then that non-cooperation would continue thereafter. So in a tit-for-tat strategy, both sides start by cooperating. Potentially, if they don't make a blunder and are thinking for the long term, they continue to cooperate. But if one cheats, then the system tilts over into non-cooperation thereafterwards. Now, this tit-for-tat strategy is a simple way to run one's life, and it's not a bad way, which is, I'm biased towards cooperating, but I'm not going to be cheated again by somebody who has tricked me. So I will cooperate as long as you're cooperating, but if you cheat, okay, forget it. I'm not going to be a sucker any longer. This strategy turns out, compared to many, many other approaches, to be a very robust, simple, and rather effective strategy for playing a prisoner's dilemma situation. And it generally leads to lots of cooperation. It has one problem, though. it is vulnerable to falling into the trap of non-cooperation forever. Two parties are getting along, they're each cooperating, they're getting benefits of mutual reciprocal action. And then one of them makes a mistake, a misjudgment, stumbles, an error, and cheats, maybe even unintentionally. The other side says, I'm not going to cooperate with you anymore. And from then on, they can't reestablish cooperation. And so the tit-for-tat strategy is pretty good for motivating cooperative behavior, but it's very bad for a feuding couple that is stuck in endless rounds of non-cooperation. And so there is a modification of the tit-for-tat strategy called tit-for-tat with forgiveness. Tit-for-tat with forgiveness says, after a few moves of this hellish environment where we're not cooperating, one or the other, maybe somewhat randomly, is going to try cooperating again. I'm going to put my toe in the water of reverting to cooperation, and I'll see whether that entices my counterparty to do the same. Maybe we can get back on the path of mutual gain. So tit-for-tat with forgiveness says each player plays the tit-for-tat strategy, but if they're stuck in non-cooperation, one or the other is going to try to reestablish a mode of cooperation so that this feud, this vendetta, does not go on forever. That turns out to be even better than the tit-for-tat strategy in practical play. Now, there's another variant of the prisoner's dilemma. It's structurally very similar, but it comes in a different context. And that is public goods games. A public good, like Central Park, is a good that benefits everybody. And investing in a public good is a way to invest in everybody's well-being. So it's a pro-social act. If we give money to the Central Park Conservancy, we're benefiting New Yorkers broadly. And investing in a public good is a good way to spread well-being, but it is individually costly. So it raises the problem of pro-sociality and raises the problem of motivating investments in public goods. Let me give you an example. Suppose that each person can make a $20 donation each year in the upkeep of a local park, and that the benefit of that $20 is $30 of gain. But that $30 of gain is social gain, $15 to the two people that use the park. So each person can invest $20, and that would give themselves $15 of benefit and the other party $15 of benefit, $30 of benefit in total. From a cost-benefit analysis, it's a good deal. $20 gives $30 of benefit. But from an individual's perspective, more problematic, because $20 of investment gives me $15 of benefit. So I end up -5. It's true that my counterpart does get $15 of benefit. So overall, the social gain is 10. Well, this is the trickiness of a public good, that the benefits do not accrue to the individual herself. And therefore, the challenge of investing in public goods is a pro-social challenge. From each individual's perspective, not giving is better than giving if you take a very narrow individualist perspective, because giving puts you out $5 and not giving puts you out nothing. But this calculation ignores the fact that you're benefiting the other party by a full $15 as well. So in a public good, both parties should contribute. For example, $40 of joint investment, 20 from each, brings $60 of social benefit, which are then shared equally between the two, $10 and $10. So if each party invests 20, they end up with 10 and 10. If each party does not invest, they end up 0 and 0. And if one invests and the other does not invest, the investor loses 5 and the non-investor gains 15. Well, you can see this is the same prisoner's dilemma setup as before, motivated in a slightly different way. It says that there is an advantage of both parties investing in the public good, but there's a reason to believe that each party will free ride, not invest, hoping that the other will still make the investment, because that's the best outcome. And yet the outcome in equilibrium, according to the economic reasoning, would be the lower right-hand quadrant, that neither party invests in the park, even though there's a big social benefit to invest in the park. Such is the challenge of directing resources to public goods. Well, how could this be overcome, by the way? One easy way in this society of two people and one park would be to tax both parties. You don't have a choice. You're being taxed 20 bucks. And that $40 is going into the city budget for park upkeep, and you're going to get $30 of personal benefit from that, so don't complain. And that's how cities maintain parks. The other way to maintain parks is public spiritedness, and to honor those who give the 20 bucks, or to put their name on the park bench as they do in Central Park. And therefore, there are many ways to motivate the pro-social behavior. But the challenge is that public goods are like prisoners' dilemmas, where there's a gain from cooperation, but an individual incentive to shirk or cheat or defect, or, as we say with public goods, to free ride. Let the others pay for it. I won't be a sucker. Examples like pollution are also public goods examples. And I give an example here, which I won't dwell on. I'll let you look at it, about our carbon dioxide emissions from vehicles. When we drive, we create social damage. The damage goes to all 8 billion people on the planet. It's a fraction of $0.0000001 for each person, but for 8 billion people, that turns out to be $80 for each ton of CO2 emission. And so when we drive, we create social damage all over the world, but the damage to ourselves is absolutely tiny. We're just not taking into account the damage to our neighbors, to the people in the next city, to the people around the world. So we have a public goods problem. And the public goods problem says we should all be driving electric vehicles, not internal combustion engine vehicles. But we each have the incentive to free ride, choosing perhaps the less expensive vehicle and imposing the pollution cost on the rest of society. So there are many variants of pro-social or anti-social behavior. Avoiding pollution is a kind of pro-social behavior, but the outcome might be an underinvestment in pollution control. Excuse me. So, some basic facts then about pro-sociality. Most importantly, thanks God for human beings, people are more pro-social than is predicted by their individual payoffs. This is a lesson for mainstream economic theory. People cooperate more than is predicted by game theory. The dictator shares the endowment. The first player trusts the second player. Two players reciprocate in the prisoner's dilemma. Two or many players invest in public goods. This kind of pro-sociality actually occurs both in the classroom, in the laboratory, and in society. And there are several possible motivations for this pro-sociality. As I mentioned, altruism, that is concern about the well-being for others. Reciprocity, saying what goes around comes around. If I'm good to others, they'll be good to me. A sense of fairness or justice. Conformity, because that's the social norm, or a desire for social esteem. And I don't know if you have seen this demonstration of macaque monkeys showing this idea of fairness as being a pretty hardwired trait. And let me show you this short video.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out.
Can people see this?
Jeff, we can't see it. I think we share your web browser screen.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, hold on. Let me try it again. Sorry about that. We'll go back. And can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Out with capuchin monkeys.
Hold on. Let me start it again then.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
Have you seen that before? Amazing, huh? We are capuchin monkeys, definitely. Oops, sorry. I got to turn that off. Okay. Yeah, that is, I think, fairly amazing. Let me go back to the PowerPoint, if I can. So the idea is that this sense of fairness is pretty hardwired, it seems. We understand what sharing is and react viscerally when something is unequally shared. The cucumber is fine as long as the monkey in the next cage is also getting a cucumber. But if the monkey in the next cage starts getting a grape, then all bets are off. So this raises a question also about the biological evolution of pro-sociality. Clearly, there are pro-social motivations and sense of fairness that are hardwired in us, that are the result of evolution. There is an enormous amount of study of how biological evolution could create tendencies towards pro-sociality. And Charles Darwin himself, in his great masterpieces, surmised that cooperation was a evolutionarily derived trait of certain species, including human beings. So what are some of the pathways possible for pro-sociality? One is that the caregiving system that binds the mother and child leads to more generalized attitudes of altruism. So it turns out that caregiving, the mother-child relationship, is mediated by neurotransmitter hormones, especially oxytocin, which is a neuromodulator which contributes to altruism. And what researchers have found is that if you spray oxytocin in the noses of people who are playing games like The Prisoner's Dilemma, lo and behold, just that tends to raise the amount of cooperation or altruism in the game. We are biological species, and so we have a biology that leads to altruism, and the caregiving network, the mother-child network, which is essential for the child's survival, also seems to play a broader behavioral role. Similarly, we have in our brain so-called mirror neurons, which in our cortex, which are centers of empathy, so that because of these mirror neurons, which are part of our capacity to understand the feelings and motivations of others, the so-called theory of mind, these mirror neurons actually make us hurt when someone else is hurt. When we watch someone else being physically hurt, we feel ourselves that pain. And the mirror neurons are part of our brain network, evolved most likely so that we can have cooperative behaviors that lead to direct empathy, that is the feeling for what others are feeling, and that conduces to pro-sociality. Reciprocity, many biologists and game theorists have shown, may well be an evolutionarily selected trait, because reciprocity, the capacity for altruistic or reciprocal altruism, so-called, where you're helping others so that they will help you, enhances individual fitness and therefore would be selected in an evolutionary way. Such reciprocity, however, is selected only if your pro-social behavior in the evolutionary setting actually elicits pro-social behavior towards you. And that would be the case, for example, in human species where language enables reputation so that we are able to gossip and say, that person is a cheater, that person tends to cooperate. The combination of linguistic ability, the formation of reputation within groups could lead to improved individual fitness for cooperators. Another theory of pro-sociality is a trickier one, which says that traits that strengthen within group cooperation might make such groups more powerful in their competition without groups. And this leads not to general altruism, but to parochial altruism, which is I will help my own kind. I will support my group, but I will oppose the other group. So I will cooperate in group, but have conflict, anti-sociality without groups, parochial altruism. I should have added another category here of kin selection, that helping one's close relatives propagates one's own genes. And so the biologist Hamilton proposed 60 years ago that kin selection means that we would have an evolutionary tendency to help our children or our cousins or those who carry the same genes of cooperation that lead to that kind of behavior. And kin selection, therefore, is another biological pathway to pro-sociality. One of the important recent conclusions about pro-sociality is that the different forms, altruism, reciprocal behavior, norm setting, the different motivations of pro-sociality probably have different neural pathways, different brain networks associated with them. And this is demonstrated by giving different kinds of pro-social games or choices to individuals when they're in an MRI. And so using functional MRI or other kind of imaging technologies has enabled neuroscientists to show that our brains are hardwired for pro-sociality, but different kinds of pro-sociality lead to different pathways of behavior. Well, if pro-sociality is so good, why is it so difficult to avoid antisocial behavior? And I think that there are three kinds of reasons. One, we saw right from the beginning. The logic is that pro-sociality is good, but it creates dilemmas for individuals. Cheating can be the preferred strategy. And so evolution has made us a divided character, a divided soul, as theology and as philosophy has argued for millennia. We have a good side to us to cooperate. We have a bad side to us to cheat, to steal, to defect. And therefore, when we face social dilemmas, they can go either way depending on context, upbringing, training, personality, and so forth. Second reason that pro-sociality can be difficult is that at least part of pro-sociality is within group bonding, but actually designed to strengthen the group in its antipathy or conflict with the outgroup. So we are probably hardwired for prejudice and for even hatred, or at least primed for hatred against out groups. This is, I think, one of the deep flaws and vulnerabilities of human nature, is that it's not so hard to instill a sense of hate against others, that probably has an evolutionary base in that we are primed to support our group in its competition with other groups. And a third reason why pro-sociality is sometimes difficult is that we know that perhaps 1 or 2 or 3% of individuals, even a president every century or two, has an antisocial personality disorder or a psychopathy. And that means that some individuals are hardwired to be antisocial or to not even understand what pro-sociality might mean, or to view pro-social behavior purely in a manipulative and deceptive sense. So finally, let me just say that as we continue our investigations, we will see that there are many ways to sustain pro-social behavior, which society needs for cooperation and well-being. One is contracts. So don't leave it to chance, don't leave it to trust, write it down. And business depends on contracts, and one of the core roles of government is contract enforcement of the court system. Another way to sustain pro-sociality is taxation. If the question is, how are we going to fund the park? Raise taxes, then everybody pays and everybody benefits. Similarly, regulation to prevent antisocial behavior. For example, a regulation that says, after such and such date, you will not be allowed to own or drive an internal combustion engine vehicle because they will be phased out. And it may be by 2030 or 2035 that sales of internal combustion engine cars will be prohibited by regulation. Another way to enforce pro-sociality is torts. Tort law is when you sue somebody because they have infringed your rights. Maybe they've cheated on you, financial fraud or embezzlement or stealing from your joint business or polluting your property. So tort law is court-made law to protect your property rights. More generally, laws against antisocial behavior, like anti-fraud laws, play an important role. We have seen that strategic play in iterated circumstances, building reputations, responding to context, can sustain pro-sociality. Social status can sustain pro-sociality by giving honor to people who behave well, and stigmatization for those who engage in antisocial behavior. Other kinds of social punishment or even ostracism might enforce pro-social behavior. And then the one that I like, and Aristotle liked it, is the idea that we can cultivate the virtues of pro-sociality through moral instruction, through education, and through habit formation, learning to be pro-social by being pro-social, and over time developing the virtues of pro-sociality. We've reached the end of the time. I have infringed on your time by 4 minutes. That's antisocial behavior, but I thank you very much for the class today. Tony will be Professor Annette will be presenting on Friday, and I will see you next week. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Okay. See you all on Friday, I guess.
See you Friday. That was great fun. Thank you.
Yeah, see you, James.
Hey, Tony, can you stick around for a minute so we can test out some of the
Yeah,
stuff?
I can. I'll stick around, Jesse.
You want to make me a co-host and let's see what happens.
Absolutely do that right now.
Nice.
Okay, your co-host. I'm going to stop the recording.
I might have to